They say you never really know someone until they're tested. I used to believe my wife, Alina, was untouchable, someone whose loyalty I never needed to question. She was the kind of woman who turned heads at every party, the person you'd imagine could walk into any room and leave with everyone's admiration. And I'll admit it, I was proud of that. Proud that she chose me, of all people, to be her partner. But lately, things had started to feel off. It began with small things, fewer shared laughs, more time spent on her phone, and an almost imperceptible distance in the way she touched me, like I was someone she'd grown weary of. At first, I brushed it off. People get busy. Life gets stressful. She'd always been ambitious, and I figured maybe it was just work or some passing mood. Then came the secrets. It was the way she'd slip into another room to take calls, how she'd tilt her phone screen away when I walked past. I'd hear the soft buzz of messages late at night, her muted giggles when she thought I was asleep. If I asked her about it, she'd wave it off, saying it was nothing, just a friend or her work group chat. But her answers came too quickly, like she'd rehearsed them. One evening, as I sat at the dining table finishing some paperwork, I noticed her phone lighting up on the kitchen counter. She was in the next room, so I called out, "Alina, your phone's buzzing. Want me to check who it is?" "No, it's fine," she replied, almost too quickly. "Probably just my sister." She didn't move, didn't even glance at the phone. But when she thought I wasn't looking, she slipped back into the kitchen, picked it up, and left the room without a word. I pretended not to notice, but that pit in my stomach grew a little heavier. The real shift came on a Saturday afternoon. We'd always had this tradition of spending lazy weekends together, cooking, watching old movies, or just enjoying each other's company. But that day, she had a sudden errand. She got dressed up, something casual but undeniably flattering, and said she had to run to the store for a few things. "Want me to come with you?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. Her hesitation said more than her words. "No, it's fine. It's just a quick trip. You don't need to bother." She kissed me on the cheek before leaving, but it felt hollow, like she was just going through the motions. I watched her drive away, a sense of unease creeping over me. Something wasn't right, and no amount of self-reassurance could shake that feeling. Over the next few weeks, her absences became more frequent. She'd have late-night meetings or last-minute work dinners. Her explanations were plausible, too plausible, really. It was as if she'd spent time crafting excuses that wouldn't raise suspicion. But her stories didn't line up. I caught her in little lies. Nothing major, just inconsistencies that left me wondering if I'd ever really known her at all. I started paying closer attention. Where was she going? Who was she with? My mind became a battlefield of doubts and questions. One evening, while she was in the shower, I couldn't resist picking up her phone. It was locked, of course, and I didn't have the code. I felt like a fool standing there, phone in hand, debating whether I should confront her outright or wait for more concrete evidence. But then, I remembered something my father used to say: trust is earned every day. Lose it once, and it takes a lifetime to get back. That night, as I lay awake beside her, listening to the sound of her breathing, I knew I couldn't keep ignoring the signs. Whatever was going on, I had to know the truth. Because the cracks in our perfect marriage were no longer small, they were spreading, threatening to shatter everything we'd built. I didn't have to wait long for the next sign. One evening, Alina came home with a strange energy, nervous but excited. She had that look people get when they've got news they're itching to share but aren't quite sure how it'll be received. She slipped off her heels by the door, muttering something about a long day, but I could tell her mind was elsewhere. Over dinner, she barely touched her plate, her gaze flickering between me and her glass of wine. I let her fidget, waiting for her to speak, knowing she'd eventually crack. "Artem," she started, her tone casual, too casual. "Do you ever think about, I don't know, bigger opportunities?" I raised an eyebrow, unsure where this was heading. Bigger how? Like, what if something came along that could change everything for us? Something that could give us the kind of life we've always talked about. Traveling, no financial worries, the works. There was a gleam in her eye, the kind she used to get when she was dreaming big. But this time, it felt off. Forced. "I'd say it depends on what we'd have to give up for it," I replied cautiously, watching her reaction. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course. I mean, it's just hypothetical. But imagine if someone offered us an opportunity, something unconventional, but the kind of thing that could set us up for life." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I leaned back in my chair, trying to keep my expression neutral. "Unconventional how?" She hesitated, swirling the wine in her glass before taking a long sip. Well, I ran into someone today. An acquaintance. Dmitry Volkov. The name rang a bell, though faintly. Dmitry was a businessman, a smooth talker who always seemed to be circling the edges of high society. I'd met him briefly at an event years ago. The kind of man who exuded power and charm, but in a way that made your instincts scream caution. What about him? I asked, keeping my tone light. She hesitated again, her smile faltering. He mentioned he's been looking for partners. For a venture. Something lucrative. He said he sees potential in me, that I have the kind of presence and charm his clients respond to. I didn't like where this was going. What kind of venture? Well, it's just for one weekend, she said quickly, her words spilling out like she'd been rehearsing them. Dmitry has this event. A private gathering with high-profile clients. He said if I accompany him, just as his guest, it could open doors. For both of us. I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. You're telling me this Dmitry Volkov wants you to accompany him to a private event. And what, exactly, does he expect in return? She waved a hand dismissively, as though brushing off my concerns. Nothing inappropriate. He was very clear about that. It's just, he needs someone poised and elegant by his side. It's purely professional. I didn't buy it. Not for a second. Dmitry wasn't the kind of man who did anything purely professional, and Alina wasn't naive enough to believe otherwise. How much did he offer? I asked bluntly. Her eyes flickered with guilt, and that's when I knew. Artem, it's not about the money. How much, Alina? She sighed, setting down her glass. 500,000. For one weekend. The number hit me like a punch to the gut. A part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, but another part, a darker, angrier part, wondered how she could even consider something like this. And you think this is a good idea? I asked, my voice colder than I intended. She straightened, defensive now. I haven't decided anything. I just thought we should talk about it. This could change everything for us. Artem, do you know what we could do with that kind of money? Pay off the mortgage, invest, travel. Sell your dignity? I cut her off, unable to hide the bitterness in my tone. Her face flushed with anger. It's not like that. You're making it sound cheap when it's not. This is about opportunity, about being smart and strategic. People do this kind of thing all the time in business. Networking, building connections. I pushed back my chair, standing up. Networking. Alina, this isn't networking. This is selling yourself out for money, no matter how you try to dress it up. She glared at me, her jaw tight. You don't understand. You've always played it safe, always done things the hard way, and look where it's gotten us. I'm trying to do something for us. For our future. For our future, I repeated bitterly. Right. I walked out of the room before the argument could spiral further, leaving her sitting there, clutching her wine glass like it was the only thing holding her together. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind churned with questions and doubts. Why was she so eager to entertain this offer? Was it just about the money, or was there something else, something I didn't want to admit? Whatever the case, one thing was clear. This wasn't just about a proposal. It was a test, and not just for her. For us. And something told me the cracks in our marriage were about to become fractures. The next morning, Alina acted like nothing had happened. She moved around the house with a forced cheerfulness, humming to herself as she brewed coffee, chatting casually about plans for the weekend. But I wasn't fooled. If anything, her attempt at normalcy only made my suspicions worse. I played along, though. I needed to stay calm, to gather my thoughts. There was no sense in confronting her again. Not yet. Not until I had something concrete. Over the next few days, I noticed more signs. She was more protective of her phone than ever, keeping it either locked away in her purse or glued to her hand. She'd step outside to take calls, her voice low and hurried. When I'd ask who she was talking to, she'd shrug and say it was work or her sister. But the real turning point came when I decided to follow her. It was a Thursday afternoon, and she'd told me she had a late meeting at the office. Something about a new project that required her attention. She left the house dressed sharper than usual, her makeup flawless, her hair styled to perfection. I waited 20 minutes before grabbing my keys and heading out. Parking a few blocks from her office, I watched from a distance, expecting to see her walk inside. Instead, she turned down a side street, heading toward a sleek black car parked at the curb. I recognized the man leaning against the car instantly. Dmitry Volkov. My chest tightened as I watched them exchange pleasantries, her smile a little too wide, his charm turned up to full volume. He opened the passenger door for her, and she slid inside, her body language unmistakably comfortable, like this wasn't the first time. I followed them, keeping a safe distance, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. They drove to an upscale restaurant downtown, the kind of place where reservations were booked weeks in advance. I parked nearby and watched from across the street as they were seated in a private booth near the back. For the next hour, I sat there, watching and waiting, the pit in my stomach growing deeper with every passing minute. They laughed, leaned in close, and seemed completely at ease. Dmitry handed her a folder at one point, and she flipped through its contents, nodding as he spoke. When they finally left, it was clear they weren't heading back to her office. They got into the car, and this time, Dmitry drove. I followed them to a high-end hotel on the outskirts of the city. Alina hesitated at the entrance, looking over her shoulder as if scanning for prying eyes. Then she followed him inside. I stayed in the parking lot for what felt like hours, my mind racing. Was this the meeting she'd mentioned? Was this what her opportunity really looked like? When she finally came home that night, she acted like nothing was out of the ordinary. She kissed me on the cheek, told me her meeting went well, and even joked about how late it had gone. I nodded, playing the part of the oblivious husband, but inside, my thoughts were anything but calm. That night, I decided it was time to take action. The next day, I reached out to an old friend, someone who worked in private investigations. Sergei had always been good at uncovering the truth, and if anyone could help me figure out what was going on, it was him. I told him everything, about Alina, Dmitry, the proposal, the lies. Follow her, I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. I need to know everything, where she goes, who she talks to, what she's planning. I need proof. Sergei didn't ask questions. He just nodded, jotting down details and assuring me he'd get to the bottom of it. Over the next week, Sergei kept me updated. Alina's meetings were anything but professional. She met with Dmitry twice more, each time at different locations, a cafe, a gallery, and once at his private residence. Their conversations were discreet, but Sergei managed to capture snippets that painted a clear picture. Dmitry was grooming her for something bigger, something more than just a guest appearance. The final straw came when Sergei handed me a series of photos. Alina and Dmitry, standing too close, their interactions far too intimate for comfort. In one of the shots, Dmitry handed her an envelope, and the look on her face said everything I needed to know. This wasn't just business. As I stared at the evidence, a wave of emotions crashed over me. Anger, betrayal, heartbreak. But beneath it all was something else. Resolve. This wasn't just about Alina's betrayal anymore. This was about reclaiming my life, my dignity. If she thought she could play me for a fool, she was about to learn how wrong she was. The cracks in our marriage had become a gaping chasm, and now it was time to see just how far she was willing to fall. After seeing the photos and hearing Sergei's updates, I felt a cold determination settle over me. There was no use in confronting her now. Not yet. A simple argument would only lead to lies, denials, and maybe even tears. Alina had crossed a line, and I needed to make sure she knew just how far she'd fallen when the truth came out. Dmitry's involvement wasn't a coincidence. I'd suspected as much when his name first came up, but now I knew for sure. Sergei had uncovered a few interesting details about Dmitry's background. He wasn't just a businessman, he was also someone who thrived in murky waters, an opportunist with connections in every dark corner of the city. That was exactly why I had approached him in the first place. Months ago, when I started noticing Alina's change in behavior, I needed someone like him to test her loyalty. Dmitry owed me a favor, and I cashed it in without hesitation. What better way to expose the truth than to have her face a choice? A choice between me and whatever temptation Dmitry could offer. The plan had been simple. Dmitry would approach her, charm her, and present her with an irresistible offer. The idea was never to push her too far, just far enough to see if she'd take the bait. But now, as I stared at the evidence Sergei had collected, I realized she hadn't just taken the bait, she devoured it whole. Dmitry had gone beyond what we'd initially discussed, likely out of his own curiosity or maybe just because he enjoyed the game. He'd been testing her limits, seeing how much she was willing to risk. And Alina! She hadn't hesitated. I spent days preparing the next phase of the plan, working with Dmitry and Sergei to ensure every detail was flawless. Dmitry would escalate the situation, pushing her to fully commit to the opportunity he'd been dangling in front of her. Meanwhile, Sergei would stay in the shadows, documenting everything. There was a grim satisfaction in knowing that every step she took toward Dmitri was another step away from me. She didn't realize it yet, but every choice she made was being recorded, every lie she told building the case against her. I focused on staying calm, even as I watched her continue her charade at home. She still played the role of the devoted wife, cooking dinner, asking about my day, and smiling like nothing was wrong. But I could see through the facade. Her eyes gave her away, restless, calculating, as if she were always waiting for something. And then, the moment came. Dmitri arranged a final meeting, something grand and impossible for her to resist. He told her it was an exclusive weekend getaway at a luxurious villa, where she'd mingle with powerful figures and secure her place in this opportunity. He left out the part where Sergei and I would be watching from a distance, waiting for her to reveal just how far she was willing to go. It was surreal watching her pack for the trip. She'd told me it was another work conference, something vital and unavoidable. I let her lie, even helped her carry her suitcase to the car. There wasn't a hint of guilt in her demeanor, no sign of hesitation. As she drove away, I felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and a deep sense of resolve. She had made her choice, and now it was my turn to show her the consequences. The plan was in motion, and there was no turning back. Alina thought she was heading toward a weekend of luxury and opportunity, but what awaited her was something entirely different. It wasn't just about exposing her betrayal anymore. It was about making her face the reality of her actions, stripping away every illusion she'd built around herself. By the time this was over, she wouldn't just lose me, she'd lose everything she'd traded her loyalty for. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of clarity. I wasn't the fool she thought I was. I was the man who would show her the cost of betrayal. The weekend came faster than I expected. By the time Saturday morning rolled around, I was sitting in the quiet of our kitchen, staring at the empty chair across from me where Alina usually sat. It struck me how easily she had lied, how effortlessly she had walked out the door and into the arms of another man. Dmitri kept me updated throughout the day, feeding me every detail of what was happening. Alina had arrived at the villa in high spirits, her eagerness palpable. The villa itself was extravagant, perched on the edge of a cliff with sweeping views of the ocean. Dmitri had gone all out, creating the perfect illusion of wealth and exclusivity. From the moment she stepped inside, she seemed to shed the last remnants of her guilt. She laughed at Dmitri's jokes, sipped the champagne he offered, and settled into the role of a woman who belonged in such luxury. Her hesitations, if there had ever been any, were nowhere to be found. As the hours passed, Dmitri played his part perfectly, drawing her deeper into the web we'd spun. He had always been good at this, making people believe in the impossible, pulling them into a world they didn't realize was an illusion until it was too late. Alina didn't just take the bait. She embraced it. By the end of the evening, she was so at ease that she barely blinked when Dmitri proposed they stay overnight to continue networking with his supposed clients. Meanwhile, I sat in silence, Sergei beside me in a rented car parked just out of view of the villa. His surveillance equipment had been capturing every word, every action, every moment of her betrayal. I didn't need to see the footage to know what was happening inside, but I forced myself to watch anyway. She had crossed a line, one I didn't think she would. It wasn't just the lies or the secrecy. It was the ease with which she had left behind everything we had built together. She wasn't the woman I had fallen in love with, the woman I had trusted with my heart. And yet, as much as it hurt, there was a cold satisfaction in knowing I had been right. This was no longer a question of whether she would betray me. It was a question of how far she would go. The next day, Dmitri escalated things further. He introduced her to a small group of actors posing as wealthy investors, each one playing their role to perfection. They flattered her, showered her with attention, and made her feel like she was the center of their world. Alina thrived under their gaze. She laughed, smiled, and leaned into the fantasy Dmitri had created for her. She spoke with a confidence I hadn't seen in years, her vanity on full display. It was as though the person I had married had vanished, replaced by someone I barely recognized. By the time the weekend ended, she had agreed to everything Dmitri had proposed. She would continue to work with him, attend more events, and expand her network. She even spoke about me, but not as a partner or husband. More like an afterthought, someone she would deal with later. When she finally returned home, the transformation was complete. She walked through the door as though nothing had happened, smiling at me like she hadn't just spent 2 days destroying our marriage. But I wasn't angry anymore. I was calm, composed, ready for what came next. She had made her choice. Now it was my turn. The betrayal was complete, and with it, any illusions I'd held onto about who she was. The cracks in our marriage had become an unbridgeable chasm, and there was no going back. The next phase of the plan was already in motion. Alina thought she had secured her place in a world of wealth and power. What she didn't realize was that every step she had taken had been orchestrated, every choice she had made carefully guided by me and Dmitri. And now, it was time for her to see the consequences of those choices. The day I'd been waiting for had finally arrived. Every piece of the plan had fallen into place, and there was nothing left for Alina to hide behind. Dmitri and I had agreed that the best way to expose her betrayal wasn't in the privacy of our home. No, it needed to be public, painfully so. It began with an invitation. Dmitri extended one to Alina, asking her to attend a celebration of their new partnership. He framed it as a formal event, exclusive and high-profile, a chance for her to solidify her position in his fabricated network of elites. She couldn't resist. She spent days preparing, picking out a dress, booking a salon appointment, and chattering vaguely about work when I asked why she was so busy. I played the part of the clueless husband, smiling and nodding, pretending I didn't notice the lies piling up. On the evening of the event, she left the house looking radiant, her confidence practically radiating from her. I followed shortly after, taking a different route to ensure she wouldn't notice me arriving at the venue. Dmitri had rented out a small private hall, lavishly decorated to maintain the illusion of exclusivity. The stage was set. When I walked in, Sergei was already there, hidden in plain sight among the guests, his equipment ready to document everything. Dmitri greeted Alina warmly, introducing her to the crowd as his special guest for the evening. She basked in the attention, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. The room was full of carefully selected players. Some were Dmitri's associates, others hired actors. Each one had been briefed on their role, to keep her distracted, to flatter her, to make her feel invincible. When the moment came, Dmitri took to the stage. He began with a toast, thanking everyone for their contributions to his venture. His speech was charming, polished, the kind of thing that made people hang on every word. And then, with a subtle shift in tone, he began weaving a different narrative. He spoke of betrayal and deception, of people who would sell their loyalty for a taste of power. He described a hypothetical scenario, one that sounded all too familiar. As he spoke, I watched Alina's expression shift from amusement to confusion and then to something closer to panic. She wasn't the only one. The guests in the room began murmuring, their eyes darting toward her. Dmitri's speech wasn't hypothetical anymore. It was pointed, direct, leaving no doubt about who he was referring to. And then he brought me out. I walked onto the stage, calm and steady, as Dmitri introduced me as the man behind the scenes, the one who had orchestrated the entire setup. The room went silent, every gaze fixed on Alina as the truth began to sink in. Dmitri didn't stop there. He unveiled the evidence Sergei had gathered, displaying photos, audio recordings, and text messages on a large screen for everyone to see. The image of Alina accepting the envelope, smiling at Dmitri, speaking casually about how she'd handle her husband, played in stark detail. Her face turned pale as the weight of it all came crashing down. The gasps from the crowd, the whispers, the stares, all of it carved into her as though the truth were a blade. I didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The evidence spoke for itself. When the presentation ended, Dmitri stepped forward and addressed her directly. In his smooth, practiced tone, he revealed his role in the plan, how he'd been working with me from the beginning. He thanked her for proving a point, not just to me, but to everyone in the room. By the time it was over, Alina looked shattered. Her confidence, her composure, even her carefully crafted image had been stripped away. She tried to speak, to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. I left the stage and walked past her without a word. There was nothing left to say. The exposure was complete. The woman who had once stood beside me as my partner now stood alone, her betrayal laid bare for everyone to see. As I stepped out into the cool night air, I felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't joy or triumph, just a quiet, steady calm. She had made her choices, and now she was facing the consequences. There was no going back. In the days following the event, Alina's world began to collapse. The repercussions of her choices came swiftly, with no mercy. The people she had once charmed, the ones who had admired her for her grace and composure, now looked at her with disdain. Word spread quickly. Dmitri had made sure of that. His network of contacts ensured that the story of Alina's betrayal reached every corner of our social circle. Friends, acquaintances, even her colleagues began to distance themselves, their polite smiles turning cold, their greetings now curt or non-existent. At home, the silence between us was deafening. Alina didn't try to explain herself or offer excuses. She barely spoke at all, her words reduced to stammered fragments when she did attempt conversation. It was as if she didn't recognize herself anymore, like she was a stranger to the person she'd become. I watched her from a distance, my own emotions a tangle of satisfaction and sadness. She spent hours pacing the house, checking her phone obsessively, as if searching for some way to undo what had happened. But there was no undoing it. Dmitri was gone, the illusion he had created for her shattered, and with it, every promise he'd made. Her job was the first to go. Sergei had made sure her boss received some of the evidence, just enough to hint at her lack of professionalism without exposing the full story. A restructuring was announced, and Alina was quietly let go, her position dissolved. Next came the financial fallout. She'd taken out small loans in anticipation of the wealth Dmitri had promised, banking on his connections to secure investments that now didn't exist. When the creditors started calling, her panic became palpable. I didn't intervene. It wasn't my place to clean up her mess anymore. She tried reaching out to her family, but their responses were tepid at best. Her mother, once her staunchest supporter, was now hesitant to engage. I had made sure her parents knew what had happened, not every detail, but enough to make them see the cracks in her character. It was strange to see someone so composed unravel so completely. Alina had always been the one with poise, the one who held everything together when things got tough. But now, she was a shadow of herself, haunted by the realization that she had gambled everything and lost. I stayed focused on my own recovery. The betrayal still stung, but there was a certain clarity in knowing the truth. I began spending more time with friends, reconnecting with people I'd pushed away during the years of our marriage. It was liberating, in a way, to step out of the shadow of her deception and into a life that felt like my own again. The final blow came one evening when Alina approached me hesitantly, her hands trembling as she held out a piece of paper. It was a list, apologies, promises, a desperate attempt to make amends. She spoke softly, her voice breaking, telling me she'd do anything to make things right, that she regretted everything and just wanted a chance to fix it. I looked at her, really looked at her, for what felt like the first time in weeks. The woman standing before me wasn't the same person I'd married. She wasn't even the person who had betrayed me. She was someone else entirely, someone broken, searching for forgiveness she hadn't yet earned. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. The distance between us wasn't just emotional. It was fundamental, a chasm that couldn't be bridged. She'd made her choices, and I had made mine. The next morning, I handed her the divorce papers. She didn't argue or plead. She simply nodded, her shoulders slumping under the weight of her own decisions. That day marked the beginning of the end. The fallout from her betrayal wasn't just about what she had lost, it was about what I had gained. Freedom. Clarity. A chance to rebuild my life without the shadow of her lies hanging over me. Alina had traded loyalty for ambition, love for vanity, and in the end, she had nothing left. Meanwhile, I had something she would never get back: control over my own future. With the divorce finalized, a strange calm settled over my life. It wasn't the triumphant vindication I'd expected, nor was it the crushing sorrow I'd feared. Instead, it felt like standing in the aftermath of a storm. Quiet, still, with the faintest glimmer of hope on the horizon. Alina moved out shortly after signing the papers, leaving behind a home that felt oddly empty without her. I thought I'd feel relief, but what I mostly felt was exhaustion. Months of tension, betrayal, and planning had drained me, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to rest. The house, once filled with her presence, began to reflect me again. I stripped away the remnants of her taste, the carefully chosen decor, the photos of us smiling through a happiness I now knew was a lie. I replaced them with simplicity, things that felt true to who I was. It was therapeutic, in a way, to reclaim the space as my own. My routine shifted as I started rebuilding the pieces of my life. Work became a focus again, a steady constant that kept me grounded. I found myself more engaged, more ambitious, throwing myself into projects with a determination that surprised even me. Colleagues noticed the change, commenting on how I seemed lighter, more present. Friends I hadn't seen in years began to reappear, drawn by my renewed energy. I spent evenings catching up over drinks, sharing stories, and even laughing, something I hadn't done in what felt like forever. Slowly, I started to remember what it felt like to enjoy life, to connect with people without the weight of suspicion or heartbreak holding me back. The hardest part was facing the memories. Everywhere I looked, there were echoes of the life Alina and I had built together. Places we'd visited, songs we'd shared, moments that had once felt unshakable. But instead of running from them, I let myself sit with the pain. I let it wash over me, knowing it would pass in time. And it did. One day, while cleaning out an old drawer, I found a photo of us from our honeymoon. We were on a beach, smiling, her head resting on my shoulder. I stared at it for a long time, not with anger or regret, but with acceptance. That version of us was gone, and I was finally okay with that. There was a certain power in letting go, in realizing that I didn't need closure from her to move forward. The betrayal had shaped me, but it didn't define me. I wasn't the man who had been wronged. I was the man who had survived. Months turned into a year, and life began to open up in ways I hadn't anticipated. I found myself trying new things, hiking trails I'd always meant to explore, signing up for cooking classes, even traveling alone. There was freedom in rediscovering myself, in stepping out of the shadow of who I'd been as Alina's husband. People asked if I was ready to date again, and for a while, the answer was no. It wasn't about fear or hesitation. I just wasn't in a rush. For the first time in years, I was comfortable being on my own, learning to appreciate my own company. But life has a way of surprising you. On a quiet afternoon at a local coffee shop, I struck up a conversation with someone unexpected. A woman who shared my love for photography, who laughed at my dry humor and didn't flinch when I spoke honestly about my past. It was just a conversation, nothing more, but it reminded me that connections could be simple and genuine. Looking back, I realized the betrayal had taught me something invaluable. It had shown me the strength I hadn't known I possessed, the resilience that carried me through even the darkest moments. It taught me to trust myself again, to value the kind of loyalty that couldn't be bought or faked. Alina had lost everything in her pursuit of vanity and greed. But I had gained something far more important, myself. And as I stood on the balcony of my home one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. The storm had passed, and I was still standing.